I have spent my entire life learning to disappear, and I had become so skilled at it that I nearly forgot I existed at all. It was only when he looked at me through the gaslit haze of that autumn evening, his dark eyes finding mine, as though I were the only solid thing in a world made of smoke, that I remembered what it felt like to be seen. My name is Vivian Blackwood, and I am the woman who solved the Whitmore murders, the Blackheath poisonings, and the mystery of the vanishing brides of Belgravia. You will not find my name in any newspaper. You will not hear it spoken in the corridors of Scotland Yard. I am 28 years old, unmarried, without fortune or beauty, remarkable enough to warrant attention, and I have lived for the past 7 years in the shadow of my uncle, Inspector Reginald Blackwood, whose reputation for brilliance is built entirely upon the foundation of my invisible work. I do not say this with bitterness. Bitterness is a luxury I cannot afford, and besides, I chose this life. When my parents died of typhoid fever and left me with nothing but a small trunk of books and a mind that refused to quiet itself, Uncle Reginald took me in. He was not unkind. He was simply a man of his time, which is to say, he believed women were made for drawing rooms and nurseries, not crime scenes and morgues. But he was also a man who drank too much, whose hands shook in the mornings, whose memory had begun to fail him in ways that terrified us both. He needed me, though he would never say so. And I needed purpose, though I had been taught that wanting such things was unbecoming in a woman. So we arrived at our silent arrangement. He brought me the details of his cases, written in his cramped handwriting on foolscap paper that smelled of tobacco and whiskey. I studied them in my small room at the back of his house on Wimpole Street, surrounded by maps of London and books on toxicology and criminal psychology that I had purchased with the small allowance he provided. I wrote my conclusions in letters that he presented as his own thoughts, and slowly, case by case, his reputation grew, while I remained exactly what society expected me to be, a spinster niece, unremarkable and unseen, existing only in the margins of other people's lives. I had made my peace with invisibility. I had learned to find satisfaction in the puzzle itself, in the moment when disparate facts aligned into truth. I told myself that the work mattered more than the recognition, that solving crimes was its own reward. And perhaps I might have believed that forever, if not for the evening when everything changed. It was the 3rd week of October, in the year 1889, and London had been swallowed by the worst fog anyone could remember. The newspapers called it a peculiar visitation, a yellow-gray shroud that turned day into perpetual dusk and made ghosts of everyone who walked the streets. People died in that fog, walked into the Thames without seeing it, collapsed in alleyways, and were not found for days. And in the midst of this atmospheric catastrophe, women began dying in their beds. The first was Lady Arabella Ashton, widow of Sir Peter Ashton, found by her maid on a Tuesday morning with an expression of such profound terror frozen on her face that the maid herself had to be treated for nervous collapse. There were no marks on Lady Ashton's body, no signs of struggle, no indication of how a healthy woman of 32 had simply stopped living in the middle of the night. The second was Mrs. Helena Carstairs, 35, widow of a shipping merchant, found in identical circumstances the following week. The same expression of horror, the same absence of any physical cause, the same unanswerable question. By the time the third woman died, young widow named Miss Prudence Whitmore, who had been married for only 6 months before her elderly husband's heart gave out, Scotland Yard was in a state of barely contained panic. 3 women, all widows, all found in their bedrooms, all dead of what the coroners could only call fright. The newspapers had begun to whisper about a phantom killer, a spectre stalking the widows of London. The public was terrified, and my uncle, who had been assigned to lead the investigation, was drinking more heavily than ever. I remember the evening he brought me the files. The fog had crept into the house, despite the fires we kept burning in every room, and the gaslight seemed dimmer than usual, as though the darkness itself had grown stronger. Uncle Reginald sat in his worn armchair by the fire, a glass of brandy trembling in his hand, and told me everything he knew, which was very little. 3 widows, he said, all of them young, all of them attractive, all of them comfortable financially, but not extravagantly wealthy. They moved in similar social circles, attended some of the same events, knew many of the same people, but no one could identify a specific connection between them. No shared enemy, no common secret. They were simply three unfortunate women who had died of fear, and no one could explain why. I asked him for the guest lists from every event all three women had attended in the months before their deaths. I asked for the coroner's reports, the statements from servants and family members, the inventory of each woman's household. And I asked, most importantly, whether anyone had noticed anything unusual about the women's behavior in the days before they died. He looked at me with those watery blue eyes that had once been sharp as flint, and he said something that I have never forgotten. He said, "Vivian, I am beginning to think that whatever killed these women is not something that can be caught by mortal hands." I told him that was nonsense. I told him that every crime had a solution, that fear alone could not kill a healthy woman, that there must be a poison or a method we had not yet discovered. But even as I spoke, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fog outside, because I had been studying the statements from the servants, and I had noticed something that troubled me deeply. All three women, in the week before their deaths, had reported feeling watched. They had complained of cold drafts in rooms where no windows were open. They had woken in the night, convinced that someone was standing at the foot of their beds, though their doors were locked and their houses secure. And two of them had mentioned, in passing, that they had seen a man at a social gathering who had looked at them in a way that made them feel as though their very souls were exposed. When I asked my uncle if the man had been identified, he shuffled through his papers and produced a name that would come to define the rest of my life: Lord Sebastian Hale, Earl of Ashworth. I knew the name. Everyone in London knew it, though not for any reason that would appear in polite conversation. Sebastian Hale was the last surviving member of one of England's oldest noble families, a man who had spent the past decade abroad after the sudden death of his young wife. There were rumors about that death, whispers that had never quite faded despite the official verdict of natural causes. Some said he had loved her so desperately that her death had driven him mad. Others said he had driven her to her grave through cruelty and neglect. Still others spoke of darker things, of unnatural practices and unholy bargains, of a family curse that claimed every woman foolish enough to bear the Ashworth name. He had returned to London 6 months ago, and since his return, 3 women had died in their beds, with terror written on their faces. It was not proof of anything. It was barely even evidence, but it was enough to make him a person of interest, enough to bring him to Scotland Yard for questioning. I was not supposed to be present for that interview. Women did not attend police interrogations, even women who solved crimes in secret. But I had learned long ago that invisibility had its advantages. There was a small anteroom adjacent to my uncle's office, used primarily for storing files and outdated equipment, and if one positioned oneself correctly and kept the connecting door open just a crack, one could hear every word spoken on the other side. I remember the sound of his footsteps first, measured and unhurried, the stride of a man who was accustomed to the world arranging itself around his convenience. Then his voice, low and smooth, with an undertone of something I could not immediately identify. Weariness, perhaps, or resignation. He spoke to my uncle with perfect courtesy, answered every question with what appeared to be complete honesty, and revealed absolutely nothing of substance. Yes, he had attended the same gatherings as the deceased women. So had hundreds of other people. Yes, he had spoken to each of them at one time or another. It would have been strange if he had not, given their overlapping social circles. No, he had no special relationship with any of them. No, he could not explain why they might have felt uncomfortable in his presence. Perhaps they had heard the rumors that followed him like a faithful hound. Perhaps they had simply been the nervous sort. He could not say. My uncle pressed him about his wife, about the death that had sent him fleeing to the continent for a decade. Lord Ashworth's voice did not change, but I heard something shift in its depths, something that sounded almost like grief. "My wife died because I could not save her," he said. "I have spent 10 years trying to understand what happened to her, and I am no closer to the truth now than I was on the night she stopped breathing in my arms. If you believe I killed her, Inspector, then arrest me. I will not protest, but you will not find evidence of any crime because there was none. Only loss. My uncle let him go. There was nothing else to be done. Lord Ashworth was a peer of the realm, protected by his title and his wealth and the complete absence of any tangible evidence against him. He walked out of Scotland Yard a free man, and I remained in my dusty anteroom, my heart beating strangely fast, my mind turning over every word he had spoken like a jeweler examining stones for hidden flaws. I should have gone home then. I should have returned to Wimpole Street and continued my invisible work, analyzing the evidence, searching for patterns, doing what I did best. Instead, driven by an impulse I still cannot fully explain, I gathered my cloak and followed him out into the fog. The streets of London at night were a different world from the London of daylight. By day, the city was a machine of commerce and industry, carriages rattling over cobblestones, vendors crying their wares, crowds pressing through streets that seemed too narrow to contain them all. By night, especially a foggy night like this one, the city became something older, something that remembered the plague pits and the Roman walls and all the centuries of human suffering that had soaked into its stones. I had walked these streets 1,000 times before, following the threads of investigations that no one knew I was conducting, but never had they felt so alive with possibility and danger. My boots made soft sounds on the wet pavement as I moved through the fog. The gas lamps were haloed with moisture, their light diffusing into soft golden spheres that seemed to float in the gray murk like will-o'-wisps leading travelers astray. I could hear the distant clatter of a hansom cab, the bark of a dog somewhere far away, the muffled laughter from a public house that appeared and disappeared like a mirage as I passed, and always, just ahead of me, the steady footsteps of Lord Sebastian Hale. I had learned many things in my years of secret investigation, but one of the most valuable was how to follow someone without being detected. The trick was to maintain a consistent distance, to match your pace to theirs, to use the natural cover of the environment without seeming to hide. The fog made it both easier and harder. Easier because visibility was so limited that I could follow more closely than I otherwise would have dared. Harder because I could not rely on visual landmarks to know where I was or where I was going. We crossed through Whitehall, past the grand buildings where the business of empire was conducted, their facades turned ghostly and insubstantial by the fog. We skirted the edge of St. James's Park, where the bare trees reached skeletal fingers toward an invisible sky. We moved through neighborhoods I knew well and neighborhoods I had never entered, the character of the streets changing around us as the homes grew larger and the spaces between them more generous. All the while, I was thinking about what I knew of Sebastian Hale. The rumors, of course, were extensive and contradictory. Some said he had been devoted to his wife, had worshipped her like a goddess, had been destroyed by her death. Others said he had been cold and distant, had neglected her for his studies, had driven her to an early grave through indifference. Still others whispered darker things, spoke of locked rooms and strange rituals and a family history that proper people did not discuss in daylight. What struck me most, as I turned these rumors over in my mind, was how little actual information they contained. They were feelings, impressions, suppositions based on nothing more than the human tendency to fill silence with speculation. No one knew what had really happened between Sebastian and Catherine Hale. No one knew why she had died. No one knew why he had fled to the continent or why he had finally returned. They only knew that he was strange and wealthy and alone, and that was enough to fuel a decade of gossip. I had made a career of looking past gossip to find the truth beneath. I had learned that the most compelling rumors were often the farthest from reality, that the people whispered about most viciously were often the most innocent, and that the true villains of this world usually hid behind facades of perfect respectability. I did not know yet what Lord Sebastian Hale was, but I was determined to find out. I told myself I wanted to observe him unawares, to see how he behaved when he believed himself unobserved. I told myself it was purely professional interest, the instinct of a detective who had learned to trust her own observations over the reports of others. But I know now that I was lying to myself. I was curious about him in a way that had nothing to do with the case, and everything to do with the strange recognition I had felt when I heard him speak of loss. The fog that night was so thick that I could barely see my own hand in front of my face. I followed the sound of his footsteps, the occasional gleam of gaslight reflecting off his dark coat, keeping enough distance to remain unseen. He walked with purpose, never hesitating, as though he knew these streets well enough to navigate them blind. And perhaps he did. The Ashworth family had lived in London for generations, their townhouse standing on a quiet square in Mayfair that bore their name. I was so focused on following him that I did not notice when he stopped. I nearly collided with his back, catching myself just in time, stumbling back into the swirling gray. And then he turned, and I found myself looking directly into his face for the first time. He was not handsome in the conventional sense. His features were too sharp for that, his cheekbones too pronounced, his jaw too severe. But there was something arresting about him, something that made it difficult to look away. His eyes were the color of deep water, that blue-gray that could appear warm or cold depending on the light, and they were fixed on me with an intensity that made my breath catch in my throat. "You have been following me since Scotland Yard," he said, and his voice was different now, less guarded, almost curious. Why? I should have lied. I should have pretended confusion, played the role of a respectable woman who had simply been walking in the same direction. But something about the directness of his gaze made dissembling seem impossible. And so I told him a version of the truth. I said, "Because 3 women are dead, and you are the only connection between them." His expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in those deep water eyes. Surprise, perhaps, or respect. "You were listening to my interview," he said. It was not a question. I did not deny it. He studied me for a long moment, taking in my plain gray dress, my sensible boots, my unremarkable face. I knew what he saw. A woman of no particular consequence, neither young nor old, neither beautiful nor ugly, the sort of woman that men's eyes passed over without registering. But he did not look at me the way other men did. He looked at me as though he could see beneath the surface, as though my invisibility was a costume he could see through. "You are his niece," he said finally. "Inspector Blackwood's niece. I have heard of you, Miss Blackwood." I felt a jolt of surprise that must have shown on my face, because he smiled slightly. "Do not look so alarmed. Your secret is not as well kept as you imagine. There are those of us who pay attention to patterns, who notice when an inspector's success rate increases dramatically after his niece comes to live with him. I have wondered about you for some time." I did not know what to say. For 7 years I had hidden in the shadows, and now this man, this suspect in a murder investigation, was telling me that he had known about me all along. It was unsettling in a way I could not quite articulate. "Walk with me," he said. It was not a question, not quite a command, something in between. The streets are not safe for a woman alone on a night like this. I should have refused. Every principle of propriety, every instinct of self-preservation, every rule I had been taught since childhood told me to decline, to make my excuses and disappear back into the fog. A respectable woman did not walk with strange men in the dark. A sensible woman did not accept invitations from murder suspects. A rational woman would have thanked him for his concern, assured him she could find her own way home, and vanished into the protective anonymity of the night. But I was not simply a respectable woman. I was not simply sensible. And rationality had never been my only guide. I found myself falling into step beside him anyway, drawn by a curiosity stronger than caution. There was something about him that called to something in me, some recognition that went beyond the facts of the case, beyond the circumstances of our meeting. He had seen me. He had known what I was, what I did, what I had hidden from the world. And instead of dismissing me or fearing me or trying to use my secret against me, he had simply invited me to walk with him. The fog wrapped around us like a living thing as we moved through the streets. I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, the warmth of him in the cold night, the faint scent of sandalwood and something darker that clung to his coat. Our footsteps fell into a natural rhythm, neither hurrying nor dawdling, and the silence between us felt less awkward than companionable. It was strange. I had spent my entire adult life in various kinds of silence: the silence of the invisible woman, the silence of the secret solver, the silence of one who has learned that her voice will not be heard. But this silence was different. This silence felt like waiting, like the moment before a storm breaks, like the breath before a secret is revealed. We walked in silence for several minutes, our footsteps muffled by the fog. I could see almost nothing beyond the small circle of murky light cast by the occasional street lamp, and I was acutely aware of his presence beside me, the warmth of him in the cold night, the faint scent of sandalwood, and something darker that clung to his coat. "You believe I killed them," he said finally. It was not an accusation, merely an observation. I said, "I believe that you are connected to their deaths in some way. Whether you are responsible for those deaths is a separate question." He made a sound that might have been a laugh, a careful distinction. "You think like a lawyer. I think like someone who has learned not to trust appearances." We turned a corner, and I realized with a start that I had no idea where we were. The fog had disoriented me completely, transforming familiar streets into unknown territory. I should have been frightened. Instead, I felt strangely calm, as though being lost in the fog with a suspected murderer was the most natural thing in the world. He must have sensed my confusion because he said, "We are in Mayfair, near my home. I am taking you a roundabout route because I wish to speak with you privately, and the direct path would have brought us past too many eyes." "Why do you wish to speak with me privately?" He stopped walking, and I stopped with him. The fog swirled around us, and in its depths I thought I saw shapes moving. Shadows that might have been people, or might have been nothing at all. "Because I need your help," he said, "and I believe you may be the only person in London capable of providing it." I stared at him. Whatever I had expected him to say, it was not that. "You do not know anything about me. I know that you are brilliant. I know that you have solved crimes that baffled the finest minds at Scotland Yard. I know that you see patterns that others miss, that you understand the human heart in ways that most people cannot fathom. And I know that you are not afraid of me, which is more than I can say for almost anyone else in this city. I am not afraid because I have not yet determined whether you are guilty." He smiled again, that slight, sardonic curve of his lips that I was coming to recognize. "That is precisely why I need you. You are the only person who is willing to look at the evidence instead of simply believing the rumors." I considered his words carefully. There was something in his voice, beneath the smooth surface of aristocratic confidence, that sounded almost like desperation. And despite everything I knew about him, despite the 3 dead women and the whispers that followed him like ghosts, I found myself wanting to believe him. "What is it you want me to help you with? I want you to find out what is killing these women. Because I promise you, Miss Blackwood, whatever is responsible, it is not me." He reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper, which he pressed into my hands. "This is the address of my townhouse. Come tomorrow evening at 8 o'clock. Tell no one where you are going, and bring whatever questions you wish to ask me. I will answer them all." Before I could respond, he turned and walked away into the fog, his dark figure disappearing so quickly that within moments I could see no trace of him at all. I stood there for a long time, the paper clutched in my hands, my heart beating a rhythm I did not recognize. I should not have gone. I know that now, just as I knew it then. A respectable woman did not visit an unmarried man's home unchaperoned. A rational detective did not accept an invitation from a murder suspect. But I was neither entirely respectable nor entirely rational, and Lord Sebastian Hale had offered me something I had never been offered before. The chance to work openly, to use my mind without pretense, to be acknowledged for what I truly was. And so, the following evening, I dressed in my best gray silk and made my way through the lingering fog to Ashworth House. The house was exactly what I had expected, a Georgian mansion of dark stone and tall windows, set behind an iron fence that separated it from the street like a moat surrounding a fortress. Gas lamps flanked the entrance, casting pools of wavering light that did nothing to dispel the sense of shadow that clung to the building. I had the strangest feeling, as I approached the front door, that the house was watching me, that it was aware of my presence in a way that went beyond the ordinary attention of servants and staff. The door was opened by an elderly butler, whose face revealed nothing. He was tall and thin, with white hair combed back from a high forehead, and eyes that had seen enough of the world to be surprised by nothing. He did not seem surprised to see me, which meant Lord Ashworth had told him to expect a visitor. He did not seem curious about why an unchaperoned woman would visit his master after dark, which meant either he had seen such visits before, or he had been trained never to allow curiosity to show on his features. He took my cloak with the mechanical precision of long practice and led me through a grand entrance hall. The hall was magnificent in a way that spoke of old money and older taste. The walls were paneled in dark oak, hung with portraits of men and women who had worn the Ashworth name through centuries of history. Some of them looked proud, some stern, some faintly melancholy. And in the faces of several, I thought I glimpsed something else, a quality around the eyes that I could not immediately identify. Awareness, perhaps, or fear, or knowledge of things that should not be known. A marble staircase swept upward to the upper floors, its banister carved with leaves and flowers that seemed almost alive in the flickering gaslight. The air smelled of wood polish and old books and something faintly floral, a scent I would later come to associate with Ashworth House itself, a perfume that seemed to seep from the very walls. I followed the butler up the stairs and through a corridor lined with more portraits, more closed doors, more whispers of history, too complex to read in a single passing. The house was larger than it appeared from outside, one of those London mansions that had been expanded and rebuilt over generations until its floor plan resembled a maze more than a rational dwelling. I tried to remember the turns we took, the landmarks we passed, but the gaslight cast everything in the same amber glow, and I soon lost track of our path. Finally, we stopped before a set of double doors, and the butler opened them without announcement, standing aside to let me enter a library that took my breath away. It was a room designed for a mind that never rested. The walls were lined with books from floor to ceiling, thousands upon thousands of volumes bound in leather of every color. Red and brown and green and blue, gold letters stamped on spines that had cracked with age. Some titles I recognized, and many I did not. Ladders on brass rails allowed access to the higher shelves, and I saw that the ladders had been used, that there were gaps where books had been removed and not replaced, that this was a working collection rather than a decorative one. A fire burned in an enormous stone fireplace, casting dancing shadows across Persian rugs and leather furniture worn soft with use. 2 deep armchairs flanked the hearth, positioned for conversation or contemplation. A desk of some dark wood, perhaps mahogany or walnut, stood beneath a window that looked out on the fog-shrouded garden. Papers were scattered across its surface, weighted down with unusual objects that I did not immediately recognize. But what truly captured my attention were the artifacts scattered throughout the room. A globe that seemed older than the maps I knew, its continents drawn in configurations I did not recognize. A telescope of brass and glass, pointed at nothing in particular. A collection of crystals arranged on a velvet-lined tray. And most unsettling of all, a human skull sitting on the desk beside a crystal sphere that seemed to glow with its own inner light, though I knew that must have been a trick of the firelight. Lord Ashworth stood by the fireplace, a glass of what looked like whiskey in his hand. He had changed from his evening clothes into something more informal, a dark velvet jacket over a white shirt open at the throat. He looked less like a peer of the realm, and more like a scholar or perhaps a priest of some forgotten religion. "Miss Blackwood," he said, "I am glad you came. I was not certain you would. I almost did not. But you are here. That tells me something important about you." "What does it tell you?" "That you trust your own judgment more than the judgment of others, and that you are willing to take risks in pursuit of the truth." He gestured to a chair near the fire, and I sat down, arranging my skirts with more care than was strictly necessary. He remained standing, one arm resting on the mantelpiece, his eyes never leaving my face. "You said you would answer my questions," I reminded him, "and I will. But first, I must tell you something that will seem impossible and that you will be tempted to dismiss as the ravings of a madman. I ask only that you hear me out before you make your judgment." I nodded, my hands folded in my lap, my mind sharp with anticipation. He set down his glass and began to pace, his footsteps echoing on the wooden floor. "The women who have died," he said, "were not killed by any human hand. They were killed by something else, something that has haunted my family for generations, something that I have spent 10 years trying to understand and destroy." I waited. saying nothing. My family, he continued, has a history that is not spoken of in polite society. For centuries, the Earls of Ashworth have been collectors. We have gathered knowledge and artifacts from every corner of the world, things that most people believe do not exist, things that should not exist. My great-grandfather was a scholar of the occult. My grandfather continued his work. My father expanded it. And I, God help me, inherited all of it. He paused by the desk with the skull and crystal sphere, his hand resting on the smooth surface of the bone. Among the things my father collected was a grimoire, a book of rituals from a monastery in Eastern Europe that was destroyed during the wars of religion. The book contained instructions for summoning a spirit, an entity that fed on fear and could be directed to kill. My father, in his arrogance, believed he could control such a thing. He was wrong. I felt a chill run through me that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. Are you telling me that a ghost is killing these women? He turned to face me, and I saw in his eyes something I had not expected. Fear. Not a ghost. Something older. Something that was never human to begin with. My father summoned it 30 years ago, and he bound it to our bloodline. It cannot be destroyed. It can only be satisfied. And it grows hungry every few years. When it hungers, it kills. And it always kills women who have caught the attention of an Ashworth man. I stood up, my heart pounding. This is absurd. You expect me to believe in demons and curses? You expect me to accept that supernatural forces are responsible for the deaths of 3 healthy women? I expect you to consider the possibility, to look at the evidence with an open mind. Is that not what you do, Miss Blackwood? Is that not what makes you exceptional? Evidence requires proof. What you are describing is superstition. He crossed the room in 3 quick strides and took my hands in his. His grip was warm and strong, and I felt a shock of awareness at the contact that I could not explain. Then help me find proof. Help me understand what is happening. Because I swear to you on my wife's grave, I did not kill these women. But something did. And unless we discover what it is and how to stop it, more will die. I looked into his eyes and saw not madness, but desperation, not deception, but a terrible, consuming guilt. Whatever the truth was, he believed what he was telling me. And against every rational instinct I possessed, I found myself believing him too. I said, "Tell me about your wife." His face changed, the desperate intensity softening into something that looked almost like grief. Her name was Catherine. I loved her more than I have ever loved anything in my life. We married when I was 23, and she was 19, and for 2 years we were happy, deliriously, foolishly happy. And then one night, she woke screaming, convinced that something was in our room, something watching us from the shadows. I told her it was a nightmare. I told her she was safe, and a week later, she was dead. How did she die? The same way as the others, terror on her face, no marks on her body, no explanation that any doctor could offer. I was with her when it happened. I held her as she screamed. I watched the life leave her eyes, and I could do nothing to save her. His voice broke on the last words, and I saw tears glistening in his eyes. Whatever role he played in these deaths, his grief was genuine. That much I would have staked my life on. I sat back down, my mind racing. Very well, I will help you. But I need access to everything. Your family records, your father's research, any documentation of this ritual. And I need you to be completely honest with me, even when the truth is painful. He nodded, relief flooding his features. You will have anything you need, and I need to understand something else. Why me? You could hire investigators, occult scholars, anyone with more experience in these matters. Why did you choose a woman who solves crimes in secret for her alcoholic uncle? He smiled, and for a moment the shadows lifted from his face. Because you are the first person I have met in 10 years who looks at me as though I might be innocent. And because I saw something in your eyes last night, when you were following me through the fog, a hunger for truth that matched my own. We are alike, Miss Blackwood. Both of us searching for answers that the world tells us do not exist. Both of us willing to venture into darkness if that is where the truth lies. I should have been offended by his presumption. Instead, I felt something stir in my chest, a warmth that I had not felt in years. He was right. We were alike. And that recognition, more than anything else he had said, convinced me to stay. That night marked the beginning of an investigation unlike any I had ever undertaken. By day, I continued my work for my uncle, analyzing the official evidence, writing reports that he would present as his own. I sat in my small room at the back of the Wimpole Street house, surrounded by my maps and my books, and I studied every scrap of information about the 3 dead women that I could gather. I traced their movements through the weeks before their deaths, plotting them on a map of London that soon bristled with pins and strings. I read the statements of their servants over and over, looking for details that had been overlooked, patterns that had been missed, and I found myself returning again and again to the same troubling facts. All 3 women had reported feeling watched in the days before their deaths. All 3 had complained of nightmares. All 3 had mentioned a particular quality of cold, a chill that seemed to have nothing to do with the weather, that crept into their rooms and their bones no matter how many fires were lit or blankets piled on their beds. By night, I made my way to Ashworth House, where Sebastian, for that was how I had begun to think of him in the privacy of my own mind, opened his family's secrets to me like a man displaying his wounds. The records were extensive and disturbing. 3 centuries of Ashworth men had documented their encounters with the entity they called the Ashworth Shadow. I read accounts written in faded ink on paper that crumbled at the edges, accounts in Latin and French, and occasionally in languages I could not identify. Some of the writers had been scholars, approaching the phenomenon with scientific detachment. Others had been terrified, their handwriting deteriorating into near illegibility as they described experiences that had shattered their understanding of the world. Still others had been matter-of-fact, almost resigned, recording the details of deaths and hauntings as though they were documenting the weather or the harvest. The entity had no name, or rather it had too many names, and none of them adequate to describe what it truly was. Some called it a spirit, others called it a demon. A few, the most disturbing few, suggested that it was something older than either category, something that had existed before the distinction between heaven and hell had been invented, something that belonged to a stratum of reality that human beings were not meant to perceive. It was a presence that existed in the spaces between light and darkness, that fed on human fear the way ordinary creatures fed on flesh and blood, that could not be reasoned with or bargained with, only temporarily satisfied. Night after night, Sebastian and I sat together in the library, surrounded by these records, trying to make sense of what we were reading. He would translate passages from the older documents while I took notes. I would ask questions, probing for inconsistencies, looking for patterns, and slowly, piece by piece, we began to assemble a picture of what we were dealing with. The ritual Sebastian's father had performed had not summoned the creature. According to the oldest records, it had been bound to the Ashworth line since the reign of Henry Tudor, when the first Earl had made a bargain with something he did not understand. The details of that bargain had been lost to time, deliberately obscured by later generations who were ashamed of their ancestors' folly. But its effects had persisted for 300 years, a curse passed down through the blood, a shadow that attached itself to each new Earl like a second soul. The ritual Sebastian's father had performed had merely awakened it, strengthened it, given it more power than it had possessed in centuries. Lord Edward Hale had been a scholar of the occult, a man obsessed with proving that the supernatural was real and could be controlled through proper application of scientific method. He had spent decades gathering artifacts and grimoires, corresponding with other occultists across Europe, building a collection of forbidden knowledge that rivaled anything in the great universities. And at the height of his powers, convinced that he had finally understood the nature of the shadow, he had attempted to bind it to his will. He had failed catastrophically. The shadow had not been bound. It had been unleashed. And in the 30 years since that ritual, it had grown stronger with every woman it killed, feeding not just on their fear, but on something deeper, something that the oldest records called the soul's bright terror, that moment of absolute horror when a human being finally understands that the world is not what they believed it to be. Sebastian spoke of these things with a terrible calmness, the calmness of a man who has lived with horror for so long that he has learned to contain it behind walls of control, but I could see the strain in his eyes, the tension in his shoulders, the way his hands sometimes trembled when he handled the older documents. He blamed himself for what his father had done. He blamed himself for Catherine's death. He blamed himself for every woman who had died since, even though he had done nothing to cause their deaths, had done everything in his power to prevent them. And I began to understand why he had withdrawn from society, why he had spent 10 years wandering the continent, why he had returned to London with such reluctance. He was not a man hiding from justice. He was a man hiding from hope. He had given up believing that the curse could be broken. He had resigned himself to a life of solitude, convinced that any woman who came close to him would inevitably become the Shadow's next victim. Until me. I was not afraid of the Shadow. I should have been after reading those accounts, after understanding what it had done and what it was capable of doing. But fear had never been my weakness. My weakness was invisibility, and invisibility had made me strong in ways that other women were not. I had learned to walk through the world without protection, without the armor of beauty or wealth or masculine approval. I had learned that survival often depended not on avoiding danger, but on facing it directly, on refusing to let fear make decisions for me. And so I kept coming to Ashworth House, night after night, even as the investigation grew more disturbing, even as the evidence mounted that we were dealing with something that might truly be beyond human power to control. Sebastian tried to send me away. He argued, he pleaded, he even shouted at me once, his usual composure finally cracking under the weight of his fear for my safety. But I refused to leave. I refused to abandon him to face this alone. Perhaps that was the moment when the investigation became something more. Perhaps it was earlier, when I first looked into his eyes in the fog. Perhaps it was inevitable from the beginning, written into whatever strange fate had brought us together. All I know is that somewhere in those long nights of research, surrounded by the whispered horrors of 3 centuries, I fell in love with Sebastian Hale, and he fell in love with me. The pattern was always the same. Every few years, the Shadow would grow restless. It would begin to manifest, appearing first as a sensation of being watched, then as glimpses of movement in peripheral vision, then as a full apparition that only its victims could see. It would choose women who had attracted the attention of the current Earl, women who might be considered rivals or threats to whatever dark claim the Shadow had on the Ashworth bloodline. And it would kill them, one by one, until its hunger was satisfied. Sebastian's father had tried to control it. He had believed that if he could direct the Shadow's hunger towards specific targets, he could protect those he loved. He had been wrong. The Shadow obeyed no master. It killed whom it wished, when it wished, and nothing could stop it. Catherine had died because Sebastian had loved her. The 3 widows had died because... Why? Sebastian swore he had had no romantic interest in any of them, had barely spoken to them beyond the ordinary courtesies of social interaction. And yet something had drawn the Shadow to them. Something had marked them as targets. I spent weeks in that library, reading accounts of deaths that stretched back centuries, trying to understand the rules by which this creature operated. Sebastian worked beside me, his presence a constant warmth at the edge of my awareness, his voice low and thoughtful as we discussed each new piece of evidence. We took meals together, argued over interpretations, shared theories, and discarded them. And slowly, inevitably, I began to feel something more than professional interest. It happened so gradually that I did not recognize it at first. I would find myself thinking of him at odd moments, remembering the way he smiled or the sound of his laugh. I began choosing my dresses with more care, noticing how his eyes followed me when I entered a room. When our hands touched accidentally over a shared document, I felt a shock of heat that left me breathless. I told myself it was nothing. I told myself I was a rational woman, too old for romantic fantasies, too sensible to fall for a man who might still be a murderer, despite everything I had learned. But the heart is not rational, and mine had been hungry for so long that it seized on this connection with a desperation that frightened me. Sebastian felt it too. I could see it in the way he looked at me, in the softening of his voice when he spoke my name, in the way he seemed to arrange things so that we would be close to each other, always close, but never quite touching. We circled around the attraction like dancers, afraid to make the first move, and the tension between us grew until it was almost unbearable. It was during our third week of collaboration that everything changed. We had been working late, poring over a particularly difficult passage in one of the older grimoires, when I looked up and found him watching me with an expression that made my heart stop. "Vivian," he said, and it was the first time he had used my given name. "There is something I must tell you." I could not speak. I could only wait, my entire body vibrating with anticipation. I have tried to fight this. I have tried to remind myself of all the reasons why it is impossible. You are investigating me for murder. You are unmarried and unchaperoned. I have nothing to offer you but danger and darkness and a curse that has destroyed everyone I have ever loved. And yet I cannot stop thinking about you. I cannot stop wanting you. I cannot stop. He stopped speaking and simply looked at me, his eyes full of a hunger that mirrored my own. I should have reminded him of all those reasons he had listed. I should have been sensible and cautious and reminded us both of our positions. Instead, I rose from my chair and crossed the space between us, and I kissed him. It was not a gentle kiss. It was the release of weeks of suppressed desire, a declaration of feeling that words could not have expressed. His arms came around me, pulling me close, and I felt as though I had finally come home after a lifetime of wandering. We did not go further than that kiss. We were both too aware of the impropriety, too conscious of the shadows that surrounded us. But something had shifted between us, something fundamental and irreversible. We were no longer merely allies in an investigation. We were something more, something that had no name in the vocabulary of respectable society. That night, as I walked home through streets that had finally cleared of fog, I felt a lightness in my heart that I had never experienced before. For the first time in my life, I allowed myself to imagine a future that was not defined by duty and invisibility. I imagined a life with Sebastian, a partnership of minds and hearts that would defy every convention. I imagined being seen, being loved, being truly known. The stars were visible for the first time in weeks, scattered across the sky like diamonds on black velvet. The air was cold but clean, and I walked with my head tilted back, watching my breath rise in white plumes toward those distant lights. I thought about all the years I had spent in darkness, not the supernatural darkness of the shadow, but the ordinary darkness of a life lived without hope. I thought about how strange it was that I had found hope here, in the midst of a murder investigation, in the arms of a man who was himself a suspect. Strange, but also right. As though everything I had endured, all the loneliness and the silence and the patient invisible work, had been preparing me for this moment. As though I had been walking toward Sebastian Hale my entire life, without knowing it. I should have known that such happiness could not last. I should have remembered that the world does not look kindly on women who reach for joy. I should have been prepared, but I was not prepared for what came next. The fourth victim was found 3 days later. I learned of it the way I learned of most crimes, through my uncle's hasty notes, pushed under my door before dawn with trembling hands that spoke of how badly he needed a drink. Miss Emmeline Foster, the note said, widow, 30 years old, found in her bed by her maid. Same circumstances as the others. Her name was Miss Emmeline Foster, a widow of 30 who had attended the same charitable ball as Sebastian 2 weeks before her death. I remembered that ball. Sebastian had told me about it during one of our conversations, mentioning it only in passing, a tedious obligation he had attended out of a sense of duty to his position. He had danced with several women, he said, made the expected small talk, left as early as politeness permitted. She died in her bed, her face contorted in terror, her hands clutching the sheets as though she had been trying to hold on to life itself. The maid who found her had to be sedated before she could give her statement. And this time, there was something more. This time, there was a witness. Her young maid, a girl of 16 who slept in a room adjacent to her mistress's chamber, had heard Miss Foster screaming in the middle of the night. She had rushed to help, fighting against the paralysis of terror that gripped her limbs, and through the half-open door she had seen something that would haunt her for the rest of her days. A shadow, she told my uncle, in a voice that trembled with remembered horror. But not a normal shadow. It was tall and dark, and it had no face, but I knew it was looking at her. I could feel it looking at her. And then it started, drinking something out of her. I could see her face getting paler and her eyes getting wider, and she was screaming so loud, and then she just stopped, and the shadow turned to look at me, and I ran. The maid's words were recorded in my uncle's cramped handwriting, and as I read them, I felt a chill that went beyond the coldness of the morning air. The girl had described exactly what the old accounts in Sebastian's library had described. She had seen the shadow. She had witnessed it feeding, and she had survived. The girl had suffered a nervous collapse and was now in the care of a specialist in diseases of the mind. A doctor, Thornton, my uncle's notes said, who ran a private asylum in Hampstead for patients whose families could afford discretion. Her testimony was officially dismissed as the result of hysteria brought on by discovering her mistress's body. The coroner ruled death by natural causes, heart failure brought on by an unspecified nervous condition. The case was closed. But I knew better. I knew what she had seen was real. I went to Ashworth House that evening, not waiting for nightfall, not caring who might see me. I needed to tell Sebastian. I needed to understand what this new death meant, whether it changed anything about our understanding of the shadow, whether it put me in greater danger. Sebastian was devastated by the news. I found him in the library, the room we had made our own over weeks of shared research, but he was not at the desk or by the fire. He was standing by the window, staring out at the gray afternoon light with an expression that made my heart constrict with pain. He did not turn when I entered. He did not seem to hear me at all. I crossed the room and touched his arm, and he flinched as though I had burned him. "Sebastian," I said softly. He turned then, and I saw that he had been crying. His eyes were red, his face pale, his composure shattered in a way I had never seen before. For a moment, he just looked at me, and in his gaze I saw such anguish that I wanted to take him in my arms and hold him until the pain subsided. "It is my fault," he said, his voice hoarse. "I spoke to her at that ball. I danced with her. I smiled at her. And that was enough. That was enough to mark her for death. You cannot know that. I know the pattern. I have seen it before. Any woman who catches my attention, any woman I show the slightest interest in, becomes a target. The shadow is jealous. It wants me alone. It destroys anyone who might matter to me." He pulled away from my touch, wrapping his arms around himself as though he were cold. "I should never have involved you in this. I should have sent you away that first night. I should have lied, told you I was guilty, let you hate me. Anything to keep you safe. And I would have believed you?" I said quietly. "I would have accepted your confession and walked away?" He looked at me, and something like a bitter smile crossed his face. No, you would not have. You are too clever for that, too stubborn, too brave. Then do not blame yourself for my choices. I chose to be here. I choose to stay." He shook his head, his face ashen. "I cannot ask you to do this. You are not asking. I am choosing. I have been making my own choices my entire life, Sebastian, often against the wishes of everyone around me. Do not take that from me now." He was silent for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind his eyes. Fear against hope, duty against desire. The weight of 300 years of failure against the desperate possibility of success. He withdrew into himself, refusing to see me, refusing to continue our work. He sent a note saying that he could not bear to put me in danger, that he would rather die alone than risk my life by continuing our association. The note was brief, formal, written in a hand that trembled slightly as though the pen had been held by a man fighting against his own emotions. I read it 3 times, standing in the hallway of my uncle's house, the paper trembling in my own hands. Then I crumpled it into a ball and threw it into the fire. I ignored his wishes and went to Ashworth House anyway. The butler tried to turn me away at the door, but I pushed past him with a determination I had not known I possessed. I found Sebastian in his study, sitting in the darkness with a glass of whiskey untouched before him, looking like a man who had already consigned himself to the grave. "You cannot send me away," I told him. "We are too close to the truth, and I will not let you sacrifice yourself to guilt when there may still be a way to stop this. There is no way to stop it. The shadow cannot be destroyed. I have spent 10 years searching for a solution, and there is none. You searched alone. Now you have me." He looked up at me, and I saw tears tracking down his face. "Do you not understand? The shadow kills women who matter to me. Catherine died because I loved her. These widows died because the shadow sensed something, some potential for attachment. If I allow myself to love you, truly love you, it will come for you too. I would rather lose you now, while you are still alive, than hold your body in my arms the way I held hers." I crossed the room and knelt before him, taking his hands in mine. "Then we must find a way to destroy it before that happens. I am not afraid, Sebastian. I have been invisible my entire life. I have been nothing, nobody, a woman who existed only to serve other people's purposes, and now, for the first time, I have found something worth fighting for. Someone worth fighting for. Do not take that from me." He looked at me for a long moment, and I saw the war playing out behind his eyes. Fear against hope, duty against desire, the weight of 300 years of failure against the desperate possibility of success. Finally, he spoke. "There may be one way, one possibility that I have not yet explored because I was afraid of what it would require. Tell me." He rose and went to a locked cabinet in the corner of the study. From it, he withdrew a small, leather-bound book that looked older than anything else I had seen in his collection. "This is the original grimoire, the one my father used to strengthen the shadow. And in its final pages, there is a ritual for unmaking what has been made. Why have you not attempted it? Because the ritual requires a sacrifice, not of blood or life, but of something perhaps more precious. It requires the willing surrender of the thing the shadow feeds on, fear itself. Someone must face the shadow without fear, must look into the darkness and refuse to be consumed by it. And no one has ever been able to do that. Everyone who has tried has died." I understood then what he was telling me. The ritual required someone to confront the shadow and overcome it through sheer force of will. It required a courage that went beyond bravery, a strength of spirit that could not be taught or learned, only possessed. "I will do it," I said. "No, Sebastian, there is no one else. You cannot do it because the shadow is bound to your blood. Your very presence feeds it. But I am not an Ashworth. I have no connection to it except through you. And I have spent my entire life learning to exist without fear." It was true, I realized as I spoke. The invisibility that had been my prison had also been my preparation. I had learned to walk through the world without the protection of status or beauty or masculine authority. I had learned to face darkness alone, to trust in my own mind when no one else would. I had learned that fear was a luxury I could not afford. Sebastian shook his head, his face ashen. "I cannot ask you to do this." "You are not asking. I am choosing. Let me see the ritual." We spent the rest of the night studying the grimoire's final pages. The ritual was complex but not impossible, requiring a specific alignment of intention and action that reminded me oddly of the detective work I had done for years. It was about finding the right pattern, saying the right words, being in the right place at the right time. It was about understanding the rules of a system and using those rules to achieve a desired outcome. The ritual required a specific location, a place where the boundary between the ordinary world and the realm of shadows was thin. Such places, according to the grimoire, existed throughout the world, points where the fabric of reality had been worn down by centuries of supernatural activity. Ashworth House contained one such place, created by the ritual Sebastian's father had performed and strengthened by every death that had occurred in its vicinity since. It required specific words to be spoken, words in a language that predated Latin, that had been old when Rome was young. Sebastian spent hours teaching me the pronunciation, correcting my accent, making me repeat each phrase until I could say it perfectly, even in the grip of terror. It required specific actions to be performed, gestures and movements that would focus my intention and direct the energy of the ritual. Some of these were simple, a raised hand, a turned head. Others were more complex, requiring me to trace symbols in the air while maintaining perfect concentration on the words I was speaking. And at its climax, It required the participant to call forth the shadow and face it without flinching. This was the part that could not be taught, could not be practiced, could not be prepared for in any meaningful way. Either I would find the strength within myself to face the shadow without fear, or I would fail and die as so many others had died before me. The location was obvious once we understood what we were looking for. In the oldest wing of Ashworth House, there was a room that had been sealed for a century. Sebastian's great-grandfather had locked it after attempting the ritual himself and nearly dying. The old Earl had survived, barely, but his mind had never recovered. He had spent his final years in an asylum, babbling about shadows and eyes and a darkness that would not stop watching him. Behind that door was a space where the shadow could be summoned, where the final confrontation could take place. The room had been carved from the very foundation of the house, its walls lined with symbols that generations of Ashworths had inscribed in desperate attempts to contain the entity that haunted them. It was a place of power and terror, and I would have to enter it alone. We decided to attempt the ritual on the night of the new moon, when the darkness would be at its deepest, and the shadow's power would be at its height. It seemed counterintuitive to face the creature when it was strongest, but the grimoire was clear. The ritual required maximum contact with the shadow, and that could only be achieved when the shadow was fully manifested. We had 3 days to prepare. Those 3 days were the most intense of my life. Sebastian and I worked side by side, memorizing the ritual, gathering the necessary materials, preparing ourselves for what was to come. We assembled candles made from tallow rendered according to a specific formula. We gathered herbs that had to be picked at midnight and dried over a fire of certain woods. We copied the symbols we would need onto pieces of vellum, using ink made from ash and blood and other ingredients I did not ask about too closely. And in the hours when we were not working, we talked. We told each other stories from our pasts, the happy memories and the painful ones, the small moments that had shaped us into the people we had become. Sebastian told me about his childhood, about growing up in the shadow of the curse, about learning at a young age that his family was different from other families, marked by something that could never be spoken of in public. I told him about my parents, about their deaths, about the years of loneliness that had followed. We spoke little of our feelings, but they were present in every glance, every accidental touch, every moment of silence that stretched between us like a bridge. When our hands brushed, reaching for the same document, I felt a jolt of warmth that lingered for hours. When he leaned close to check my pronunciation of a difficult phrase, his breath warm on my cheek, I had to fight the urge to turn my head and press my lips to his. On the second night, unable to sleep, I went to the library and found Sebastian already there, staring into the fire. The flames cast dancing shadows across his face, illuminating the lines of exhaustion that had deepened over the past weeks, the gray that had begun to appear at his temples. He looked older than his 34 years, burdened by a weight that no one should have to carry. "Are you afraid?" he asked, without turning to look at me. "Yes, but not of dying." He turned then, and I saw in his eyes a question he was afraid to ask. "I am afraid of failing," I said. "I am afraid of leaving you alone with this curse, of knowing that my death will only add to your burden. I am afraid of never knowing what might have been." What might have been? I crossed the room to stand beside him, close enough to feel the heat of his body, close enough to smell the sandalwood and smoke that clung to his clothes. "You know what I mean," I said softly. He was silent for a long moment, and I watched the firelight play across his features. Then he spoke, and his voice was rough with emotion. "If you succeed," he said, "we will have a chance at something I never thought possible. A life together, a future unburdened by shadows, a chance to discover what it means to love without fear. And if I fail, then I will follow you. I will not remain in this world without you, Vivian. I have lived in darkness for too long. You are the only light I have." I went to him then, and he held me, and we stayed like that for hours, wrapped in each other's arms, drawing strength from each other's presence. His heart beat steadily against my cheek, and I listened to it as though it were a message, a promise, a declaration of everything words could not express. We did not speak of love, not in words. We did not need to. It was there in every heartbeat, every breath, every moment of that endless night. The third day dawned gray and cold, and I spent it in a state of strange calm. I had made my preparations, written letters to be delivered in the event of my death, settled my affairs as best I could. I wrote to my uncle, thanking him for the years of shelter he had provided, apologizing for the deception that had characterized our relationship. I wrote to the few friends I had made during my years in London, brief notes that said nothing of what I was about to do, but expressed my affection for them in case I never had the chance to say it in person. And I wrote to Sebastian, a letter he was not to open unless I did not survive. In it, I told him everything I felt, everything I had been afraid to say aloud. I told him that he had given me something precious beyond measure, the experience of being truly seen, truly known, truly loved. I told him that whatever happened in that room, he must not blame himself. I told him that the weeks we had spent together had been the happiest of my life. I sealed the letter and gave it to the butler with instructions that it was to be delivered to Lord Ashworth if I did not emerge from the ritual alive. The old man took it without comment, his face as expressionless as ever, but I thought I saw something flicker in his eyes, understanding perhaps, or pity, or respect. There was nothing left to do but wait. That evening, as darkness fell, Sebastian led me to the sealed room. The door was hidden behind a tapestry in a corridor that felt colder than any other part of the house. The wood was blackened with age, and strange symbols had been carved into its surface, symbols I recognized from the grimoire. Sebastian produced an ancient key, and with a grinding sound that seemed to echo through the entire house, the lock turned and the door swung open. The room beyond was empty, except for a circle carved into the stone floor, filled with symbols and surrounded by the melted remnants of countless candles. The walls were bare stone, and the air was so cold I could see my breath. But what struck me most was the quality of the darkness. It seemed thicker here, more substantial, as though it had weight and presence, as though something was already waiting for us. I stepped into the circle, and Sebastian began to light the candles. As each flame caught, the shadows seemed to recoil, pressing back against the walls like living things. I could feel them watching me, feel their hunger beating against the edges of my awareness. Sebastian finished with the candles and came to stand at the edge of the circle. His face was pale, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "I will be right here," he said. "Whatever happens, I will not leave you. I know. I love you, Vivian Blackwood. Whatever happens tonight, I need you to know that. I love you as I have never loved anyone in my life. I love you too." He stepped back, and I began to speak the words of the ritual. The language was old, older than English, older perhaps than any living tongue. The words felt strange in my mouth, heavy with power that I could not understand. As I spoke, the candles flickered and the darkness pressed closer, and I felt something stirring in the depths of the room. The shadow came slowly at first, a movement at the edge of vision, a deepening of the darkness in the corners. Then faster, coalescing into a shape that was almost human but fundamentally wrong. It had no face, just as the maid had said, but I felt its attention fix on me like the weight of a mountain, and I felt its hunger, a vast, ancient emptiness that had consumed generations of women and was now reaching for me. Fear rose in my throat, primal and overwhelming. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to hide, to escape from this impossible thing that should not exist. The shadow fed on that fear. I could feel it growing stronger, filling the room, pressing against my mind. But I had trained for this moment my entire life. I had learned to face darkness alone. I had learned to stand firm when everything around me was crumbling, and I had something that none of its previous victims had possessed. Love strong enough to anchor me when everything else was swept away. I thought of Sebastian. I thought of the life we might have together. I thought of the future I refused to surrender. And I looked into the shadow, and I did not flinch. "You have no power over me," I said, and my voice did not tremble. "You are nothing but emptiness, nothing but hunger, and I am not afraid of hunger. I have been hungry my entire life, for recognition, for purpose, for love. And I have learned that hunger can be survived, that it can even be a source of strength." The shadow pressed against me, and I felt its rage, its disbelief. For 300 years it had fed on fear. It did not understand anything else. I give you nothing, I continued. I take back what you have stolen. The fear of Catherine Hale, the fear of Arabella Ashton, the fear of Helena Carstairs, Prudence Whitmore, Emmeline Foster, the fear of every woman you have ever consumed. I take it back, and I transmute it into something you cannot digest. I did not know where the words came from. They were not part of the ritual, but they felt right, felt true, felt like the culmination of everything I had ever learned about the human heart and its capacity for transformation. The shadow shuddered. I saw it clearly now, not as a monster, but as a void, an absence, a thing that had never had substance of its own, but had borrowed its form from the fears of its victims. Without fear to feed on, it was nothing, less than nothing. I stepped forward, and the shadow retreated. I stepped forward again, and it shattered. There was no sound, no light, no dramatic conclusion. One moment the shadow was there, vast and terrible. The next moment it was gone, dispersed into ordinary darkness, unmade by the simple refusal to be afraid. I stood in the center of the circle, breathing hard, scarcely able to believe what had happened. Then Sebastian was there, his arms around me, his voice in my ear, whispering my name over and over like a prayer. We stayed in that room until dawn, holding each other, weeping with relief and joy and the release of tension that had been building for weeks. When we finally emerged, the first light of morning was streaming through the windows, and the house felt different, lighter, as though a weight that had pressed upon it for centuries had finally been lifted. The deaths stopped. No more widows were found frozen in terror, and gradually the whispers about Lord Ashworth began to fade. The official investigation concluded that the deaths were the result of a series of unfortunate natural occurrences, and my uncle was credited with bringing the case to a satisfactory resolution. He never knew the truth. No one did, except Sebastian and me. We married 6 months later, in a small ceremony that scandalized society. A peer of the realm wedding his spinster detective, a woman with no fortune and no family to speak of. The newspapers called it a misalliance. The dowagers whispered about what hold I must have over him. I did not care. I had found something more valuable than reputation, more precious than the approval of strangers. I found love. Sebastian and I built a life together in Ashworth House, filling its shadows with light and laughter. I continued my work, no longer in secret. Sebastian supported me openly, introducing me to colleagues at Scotland Yard, helping me build a reputation that belonged to me alone. In time, Vivian Blackwood became a name spoken with respect in the corridors of power. The woman who solved impossible crimes, the detective who saw what others could not. But that came later. On the morning after our wedding, when I woke in Sebastian's arms in the master bedroom of Ashworth House, I thought none of that. I thought only of how far I had come, from the invisible woman hiding behind doors to the woman who had faced darkness itself and refused to look away. Sebastian stirred beside me, and his eyes opened, those deep-water eyes that still made my heart race. "Good morning, Mrs. Hale," he said, and smiled. "Good morning, Lord Ashworth. Do you regret it? Any of it?" I considered the question seriously, as I considered all questions, the months of danger, the nights of fear, the moment in that cold stone room when I thought the shadow would consume me. "No," I said finally, "not a single moment, because every moment led me here." He pulled me closer, and I felt the steady beat of his heart against my cheek. "I spent so long believing I was cursed," he said quietly, "that everything I loved would be destroyed. And then you walked into my life and proved me wrong. Not wrong, just incomplete. You needed someone who was not afraid of curses, someone who had learned to find light in darkness, and you found me. We found each other." Outside the window, the fog had lifted for the first time in months. Pale winter sunlight streamed through the glass, illuminating dust motes that danced in the air like tiny stars. And I thought about all the women I had been. The orphan, the invisible helper, the secret detective, the woman who loved a man the world called cursed. I had been all of those women, and I had become something more, something new. Something that could not have existed without the darkness that had forged it. The shadow was gone, but its gift remained. It had taught me that fear was not weakness, that facing darkness was not failure, that love was strong enough to unmake even the oldest of curses. It had taught me that invisibility was not the same as insignificance, that the women the world overlooked were often the ones who changed it most profoundly. I had solved crimes in silence for 7 years, but silence was not the same as powerlessness, and now, with Sebastian beside me, I would solve them in the light. There would be other cases, other mysteries, other shadows to face, but I was ready for them. I had faced the darkness, and I had won, not through force or violence, but through the simple, radical act of refusing to be afraid. That, I have come to believe, is the greatest power any of us possess. The power to look into the abyss and choose not to flinch, to stand firm in the face of terror and declare, I am not afraid, to transform fear into courage, darkness into light, curse into blessing. I learned that lesson in a cold stone room in the depths of Ashworth House, with a shadow pressing against my mind and the man I loved waiting on the other side of the circle. And I carry it with me still, through every case I solve, every darkness I face, every night that falls, and every morning that breaks. My name is Vivian Blackwood Hale, and I am no longer invisible. I never was. I was simply waiting for someone to see me. And then, on a foggy evening in London, a charming suspect asked to walk me home, and I finally understood what I had been waiting for all along. Not rescue, not recognition, not even love, though love came, abundant and transformative, and more precious than anything I had ever known. I was waiting for the courage to step out of the shadows and claim my place in the light. I found that courage in the darkness of Ashworth House, facing a monster that had consumed generations. And I have never lost it since. The fog still comes to London. It still creeps through the streets, turning the familiar into the strange, the known into the unknown. But I no longer fear it. I walk through it with my head held high, my husband at my side, my mind sharp and ready for whatever mysteries it might conceal. Because I have learned the secret that the fog has been keeping all along. It is not the fog that is dangerous. It is not the darkness or the shadows or the things that lurk at the edges of vision. The only truly dangerous thing is the fear we carry inside us, the terror that makes us small and silent and invisible. And once you have conquered that fear, once you have looked into the deepest darkness and refused to be consumed, nothing can ever truly frighten you again. I am Vivian Blackwood Hale. I solved crimes in silence until love gave me my voice. And now, I speak for all the women who have ever been invisible, all the women who have faced darkness alone, all the women who have loved and lost and found the courage to love again. We are not nothing. We are not nobody. We are the light that the shadows fear, and we will never be silent again. The story of how I met Sebastian, how I faced the shadow and survived, how I found love in the most unlikely place imaginable, is only the beginning. There would be other cases, other investigations, other moments when I would have to summon all my courage and face things that should not exist. But that is a tale for another time. For now, let me end where I began, with the fog and the gaslight and the echo of footsteps on cobblestone streets. I was invisible once, a woman who solved crimes in silence, who lived in the shadows of other people's lives, who had given up hope of ever being truly seen. And then, a charming suspect asked to walk me home through the fog, and everything changed. Sometimes I wonder what would have happened if I had refused his offer that night. If I had been sensible, cautious, respectable. If I had followed the rules that society laid down for women like me, I would still be invisible. I would still be alone. I would still be living a half-life in the margins of existence, solving other people's mysteries while my own heart remained unsolved. Instead, I took a risk. I followed a man I barely knew into the unknown. I trusted my own judgment over the warnings of the world, and I found everything I had ever been searching for. That is the lesson I carry with me through every case, every investigation, every moment of darkness that descends. That the greatest discoveries come not from caution, but from courage. That the truest love is often found in the most unexpected places. That the women the world calls invisible are often the ones who see most clearly of all. The fog will always return to London. The shadows will always gather at the edges of the light, and there will always be mysteries that seem impossible to solve, crimes that seem impossible to prevent, darkness that seems impossible to overcome. But I will face them all with my head held high and my heart full of love, because I am Vivian Blackwood Hale, and I am no longer afraid of the dark. The night Sebastian asked to walk me home through the fog was the night my true life began. Every moment before it was prologue, preparation, the slow shaping of a woman who would one day face the impossible and emerge victorious. And every moment since has been a gift. I do not know how many years we have together, Sebastian and I. I do not know what shadows still await us, what darkness still crouches in the corners of the world, waiting for its moment to strike. But I know this: whatever comes, we will face it together. Whatever darkness descends, we will find the light, and whatever mysteries the fog conceals, we will solve them. Because that is who we are, that is who I am. The woman who was invisible, the woman who found her voice, the woman who learned that love is the greatest mystery of all, and that the solution is always worth the search. My name is Vivian Blackwood Hale, and this is my story, all of it, every shadow and every light, every fear and every triumph, every night of darkness and every morning of grace. It began with a question asked in the fog, and it will end only when the last light fades and the final mystery is solved. Until then, I remain what I have always been, a woman who sees what others cannot, a woman who loves with her whole heart, a woman who walks through darkness without fear. The fog is lifting now as I write these final words. The sun is breaking through, casting long shadows across the page. Sebastian is calling me from downstairs, and I can smell breakfast cooking. And somewhere in the house, a clock is chiming the hour. This is my life now. This impossible, improbable, extraordinary life that I never imagined and cannot now imagine living without. And it all began with a walk through the fog. Remember that, if you remember nothing else from my story. The greatest adventures begin with a single step into the unknown. The deepest loves begin with a moment of unexpected connection. And the strongest women are often the ones who spent the longest time invisible, learning to see the world clearly while the world refused to see them. I was one of those women. I am no longer, and I never will be again. The fog is lifting, the light is breaking through, and I am going downstairs to have breakfast with my husband, the man who saw me when no one else did, the man who walked me home through the darkness and stayed to build a life with me in the light. This is not the end of my story, but it is a good place to pause, a good place to take a breath, to look back at how far I have come, to look forward at all that is still to come. A good place to remember that every ending is also a beginning, and that the best stories never truly end. They just find new ways to continue. So I will set down my pen now, and I will go to Sebastian, and I will live the next chapter of this story that we are writing together. But I will return to these pages. I will always return. Because this is my story, and I will not let it be forgotten. Not this time. Not ever again. My name is Vivian Blackwood Hale. I solved crimes in silence. I faced the darkness and won. I found love in the most unlikely place imaginable. And I lived. I lived. I lived. That is the miracle at the heart of everything. Not that I survived the shadow. Not that I broke the curse. Not even that I found love in a world that had told me love was not for women like me. The miracle is simply this: I lived. After all the years of invisibility, all the nights of solitude, all the moments when I wondered if my existence mattered to anyone at all, I lived. And I will keep living, every day, every moment, every breath, until the final page is written and the last word is spoken. That is my promise to myself. That is my promise to Sebastian. That is my promise to every woman who has ever felt invisible, who has ever wondered if her life mattered, who has ever walked through fog alone and wondered if anyone was waiting on the other side. You matter. You exist. You are seen. And somewhere, in the vast and complicated world, there is someone who will recognize your worth, Someone who will ask to walk you home through the darkness. Someone who will stay. Find them. Let them find you. And when you do, hold on. Hold on with everything you have, because love is the light that conquers every shadow, and you deserve to stand in that light. You always have. We always have, all of us. Every invisible woman, every silent solver of crimes, every heart that has ever broken and learned to beat again. We deserve the light, and we will find it, I promise. My name is Vivian Blackwood Hale, and I am done being invisible. Forever.